It is our pleasure to have such great minds and such wonderful discussions as part of Webit Global Impact Week. And a reminder for #Webit and reminder for the fact that you can further ask questions, comment, and just share opinion on everything you hear, thanks to the TVS events platform, which Webit is using for the past 2 years. Coming up next is a fireside chat on modern leadership and sustainable business models. And we have, again, Karen Leland joining us back as a columnist at Inc. magazine and best-selling author. Karen, welcome back. Thanks for joining.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Karen Leland. I'm the president of Sterling Marketing Group. I'm a branding and marketing strategist. I work with companies and individuals on personal, team, and business brands. I'm also a color strategist, and I am so delighted to have Karen Walker join us today. She is the Senior Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer at Intel. She has been responsible for building and strengthening Intel's brand for many years, and I just am delighted that she's here to join us for this conversation. Karen, it's so nice to have you on the panel.
It's lovely to see you, Karen. We have two Karens here.
I know. We're Karen squared.
Exactly. Yeah,
we were talking about this before we went live. And, you know, the thing is that talking about leadership, and obviously leadership's been important forever, but the pandemic has sort of put this overlay over things that has made leadership, I think, even more important, but I think it's also changed the nature of leadership. And I'd love to start this conversation by asking you, how have you steered a global company as the CMO through this pandemic?
So as you talked about this earlier, Karen, I would agree. This is an intense moment of time for leadership. As you said, leadership is important any time, but I'm sure you remember the time where it said, okay, shelter in place. This will be times where people remember where they were, what they were doing. It will also be a time when people remember, how did their leaders show up? Did they care? Did they lean in? Were they empathetic? Did they have a strategy and vision that kept you engaged during this process and this period of time? For me personally, I've been in Intel a few years now, and actually I'd only been at Intel for about 4 months when the pandemic hit. And so I was undertaking a major transformation, not only of the function and our strategy, but the team. And so I basically hired a new leadership team, and I probably have only met 2 of them in person. And so it was a very new leadership experience for me, in terms of, you know, not being able to see that person face to face, get to know them in a more physical and normal sense. It actually has worked incredibly well, in terms of I've started to now meet them physically in person, and it actually feels like I've known them forever. And so
I have a question about that for you, because I've had a similar experience, by the way, where there are people I talked to for 1.5 years on Zoom, and then I finally met them in person, but it felt like I knew them. And it seems like you're saying that even though it was on Zoom or whatever video chat it was on, it seems like you're saying that you were able to form some kind of a relationship with them that transferred over to meet space, as we call it. Is that true?
That's absolutely right. It was, as I said, and I met some of them earlier this week, I just feel it's the only difference is I'm now meeting you in 3D. It felt exactly the same. It felt like I'd known them forever. And I know that a lot of leaders were worried going into the pandemic to say, you know, will I be able to keep people engaged? Will I be able to keep this relationship going? Especially for people like me who were starting new jobs and joining new companies. And we found that they were. And you know what? I got to meet their pets. I got to meet their gardener in the background. I got to meet their kids who were Zoom bombing us every 5 minutes. And there was something that was just so human and natural and warm about those engagements. Also, I don't know what it is about this. I don't know, maybe it's a confessional box or whatever it is, but it feels like it's safe and it's warm, and you're able to have some pretty intense and personal and emotional experiences in it.
But let me ask you a question about that, because I spent a lot of the pandemic coaching and training executives on using video, Zoom video, how their brand came across on Zoom video, even things like what colors to wear on video. I mean, I did a lot of that kind of coaching with clients during the pandemic. You have what we used to call when I was in the news field, the likability factor, right? You come across really well, you're personable, you speak well on video. A lot of leaders don't. A lot of leaders are intimidated by the camera, don't feel comfortable with that camera, with that video. So I think for you, maybe that transition to leadership in that sense was maybe a little easier than other people. Did you find that you had certain people on your team or certain people that you worked with where it wasn't as easy for them and they had to go through a transition to learn how to create relationship through this medium?
I think we did. I think they did. And I think we as a team had to too. You will always find in a group of people, those who are more gregarious, more outspoken, they can hold a conversation in a room. And there are others who are maybe more quiet and thoughtful, but actually have really important things to say. One thing that we did have as a norm was that everyone did have to have their camera on. And again, just looking at that face, although I have to tell you now I'm really enjoying just taking phone calls, because just listening is actually a joy again, in terms of just listening to a voice and actually being very thoughtful about what and what folks are saying to you. But what we also had to do is learn new meeting norms, right? There was the conversation at the beginning of the meeting, the close at the meeting. We also learned how to use the tools, how to raise hands, how to clap, how to send hearts. And so some of it felt, okay, I feel like I'm 12, but it did actually work in terms of giving those who could actually use the tools to actually lean into the conversation and participate. I think for those moderating the meeting, you had to be a lot more sensitive and draw people in. And you may see their expression change, or they were starting to say something and someone cut you. You have to be more intentional, I think, as a leader in terms of how you bring people together in the virtual environment.
I think that's a really important point, because I think when you're, the skill of leadership, when your workforce is diverse and people are working from home and they're working from different places, and you're managing a lot on video rather than person to people in the room together, I think that requires a different mindset as a leader, but it also requires a different skill set as a leader. I know that, just like I know, for example, in the work I've done with CEOs in terms of their executive presence and their own personal brands, I had a lot of leaders that had to learn how to manage conversations differently over video than they would have managed them if everybody was sitting in a room. And I think people I think leaders underestimated the skill set that is and the growth that it would take to learn how to do that. I mean, that's what I hear you saying, is that was one of the things that you and your team had to figure out.
We did. And by the way, I do think this hybrid environment is here to stay. And so
absolutely,
it'd be interesting to think, Karen, whether those skills that we've learned in the virtual world, how are you going to take them back into that meet world, into that physical world where, are you still going to be as attentive and thoughtful about, people engaging and having their moment to make their point? And then you're going to have a world where some people are physical. We had this before, by the way, right? We all led global teams where you had some people who were physically in the room with you and some, who were remote. I tell you what, it was a pretty awful experience for those people who were remote at that time, right? I can't hear you. What did you just say? Hey, I'm trying to say something. And, you kind of ignored the people whose faces were on the, that telly round wall. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's going to be skill sets that you bring back into the workplace that we're going to be better and more inclusive of a global team, whether someone is sitting next to you in person or looking at you directly through a window, through a screen.
I think that's absolutely accurate. I always tell my clients that before the pandemic, virtual was an or, and after the pandemic, virtual is an and. That's our shift. It's from an or to an and, because we are in that hybrid world. I want to ask you about something, because it's interesting, because I know that you've often said that your approach to leadership was forged in an orphanage. And can you share with the audience a little bit about what that experience was and the long-term effect that has had on you in terms of being a leader?
It has, and it's interesting because I said it once in an interview, and I'm usually a little bit of a private person, and it was an intense emotional recollection, and I have realized how much it actually has stayed with me. So my parents ran a children's home, is what we would call it in the UK, in the north of Scotland. And it was a beautiful stone house right on the edge of town. So in lots of places, in lots of ways, it was idyllic in terms of the natural environment. But it was a home where children came when they had nowhere else to live. There was, a lot of sadness, but also a lot of kindness and hope. And so it was really interesting because it taught me from a very early age. I have just one brother, but it taught me from a lot of early age to share love, to share leadership, and to actually be a leader. I saw very young children be leaders to even younger children, because those very young children had no one else to look up to. They had no one else to lean on, to care. And so it actually taught me a lot about leading. I mean, people will say, are you a leader? Are you a leader, Karen? And we typically think about that as, how big is your organization? What is your revenue that you're responsible for? I often ask, if you are a friend, if you are, a spouse, if you are a parent, you're a leader. But you're a leader in life. You're a leader in terms of helping guide others and, enabling things to happen. Those are skills that you use in business just as much as you use them in life. And so I think I love what you do, because it's transferring some of those leadership skills that you have in your personal lives and bringing them into a professional world. And some people find that really easy, and some people don't. So I think it is a skill, and it's an experience set that needs to be built.
I love what you said about the leadership that you saw even in young kids, and that what you learned about being a leader, because it's so interesting to me, because I think one of the things that's really changed and by the way, I think this change I think the changes we're talking about were happening anyway before the pandemic. They were just on a slower path. I think what the pandemic did was exacerbate and accelerate a lot of these changes. I think we were on these paths anyway, by the way.
Agreed.
It was an acceleration, right? But the interesting thing about leadership, and again, having spent, being a branding and marketing strategist, but having ran a management consulting firm for 20 years before that, having worked with a lot of leaders, one of the things I've really come to believe, and it's very similar to what you said, is that every moment is an opportunity for leadership. It has nothing to do with the title that you have, because I've seen frontline workers who are making $15 or $14 an hour show extraordinary leadership when their quote unquote executive manager, who's making several $100,000 a year or several $1 million a year, show almost no leadership. So leadership to me, and I think this is what you're saying, is more of a state of being and a quality and a set of skills rather than just a title that you have. And I think the way the world has changed, everyone's being required to be more of a leader in their own life, in their own career, with the brand that they establish for themselves, and in their own workplace. I think that's where we are.
I completely agree. And, when I resonate with what you said about our folks who have been the frontline workers throughout the pandemic. And by the way, a lot of them have been women. If you think about the healthcare workers, if you think about the people in the grocery stores, yet again, I think women, and there's been research, around what happened during World War II. Whenever there is a big crisis, I think folks will lean in, and I'm very proud of the women around me who've lent in and have really stepped up to the challenge of what we're facing through the pandemic. I completely agree. I think the other thing around leadership, which I also learned from an early age, is that I talk about building a kind and courageous culture. And I think that's also part of leadership, in that I think during the pandemic, Karen, I think it hasn't been just about the work. And I think that's also really come through in a very unique way. And maybe it's back to being virtual. It's been about, how are folks really So how are they dealing with what's happening in their lives? How are they doing okay? Sort of what's happening with their family. And I think that's intensified. When people have said to me that their parents have had COVID, or someone has, there is just this warmth and this empathy that's really sort of rushed forward. And in lots of ways, I think that's really brought us closer together. I think both from my leadership team, but also in communities. And I've really seen that. And I think that's goodness. I would like to find a way to keep that. And that there's some, I don't know, maybe I'm just optimistic. I think there is goodness in most things, and that you can find them and you can bring those forward.
Well, you always, even in, every crisis has an opportunity. You just have to find it. And, that's not to take away from the unbelievable amount of suffering of people having died. I mean, I personally have people that I know and we're close to that died from COVID. So not to take away from any of the suffering, but, we are where we are. And part of our job as leaders is to take what we can out of that and make the difference that we can make. I mean, that is part of our job as leaders. It's interesting because I have talked several of the clients I'm working with. One of the challenges they're having as CEOs or as senior executives, as CMOs or senior executives, is they have people that don't actually want to come back to work physically. They still want to work, but they don't want to come back to the workplace. And I'm wondering if you're encountering that and what your sort of thinking is about that moving forward.
It is, and I think we're all going to learn about this as we go through it. I think there is some school of thought that once the pandemic is really far behind us, what would that new once right. It's really over, what would that new normal look like? And I will tell you, having met some of my team in person this week, it was wonderful. It was really wonderful. And we were all vaccinated. We're all very careful. But just to be able to give people hugs, to be able to see them physically was just truly wonderful. And so there's maybe that human nature will come back over time where people will want to gather together physically. That said, I think what we have found with our teams is that they love the flexibility. I have loved the flexibility. I've been on phone calls and I've been throwing my laundry in, or, and it's been great. I can go for a walk with my husband in the morning. And so I have loved that flexibility, and our teams have too. Also, what it's allowed is for me to tap into a different talent pool, and actually a more diverse talent pool from places that I probably wouldn't have hired from before, because I don't have to have people, those who are in non-factory based or technician or engineering based roles, which frankly they have had to come in to the campus during the pandemic. But for those who are on computer or office based roles, I've been able to tap into a much more diverse talent pool and to give that flexibility. What we found, our employees, they want a hybrid. They want to come into the office, but they want to come into the office for meaningful and creative work. Yeah. They said, Karen, if you wanted me to come into the office and I sit at my desk, my pod, whatever it is, and be on Zoom calls for 8 hours, I'm sure I can do that from home.
Exactly. With the dog next to you.
With the dog. Exactly. And so, if you want me to come into the office, that's awesome. But let's coordinate it where I'm not showing up to an empty office and my colleague shows up the next day. So there's going to be some coordination that we're going to learn how to do this, because we're all still in the early stages of making that happen. But yes,
figuring it out.
We are figuring it out. But it's
interesting because what you're talking about is really how do you inspire innovation in these brands in order to have this kind of modern leadership, right? Yes. And I mean, you work for a legacy tech brand, obviously, but moving forward, what advice would you give to other CMOs or other executives about how to empower their teams and increase this equality and inspire innovation moving forward in terms of modern leadership, given the pandemic and given all the changes?
So I think some of the tenets of leadership in that scenario, Karen, hasn't changed. You still need to, it may be more challenged to do it in the hybrid environment, in that you still need to have a very strong vision for the future of your company, for the future of your function, for the future of your team. And you have to be very clear about what that is. You have to engage and to give folks that hope. I have an African proverb I use a lot, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so I think you do have to paint that vision and bring the team along, get them excited about the future. And also don't use the pandemic as an excuse not to take risks. So that risk for me was, you're right, Intel is an iconic brand. Intel put the silicon in Silicon Valley.
Yes, they did.
It did. Literally, it did. Over 50 years old. I was, I think, 9 months into the role, and we needed to kind of refresh our visual identity, our brand, new brand platform. And it was, yikes. All right, we're doing this in the 6 months into a pandemic. Intel is kind of in a transformation. So we're working through what our revenue models and what our future financials will look like. You're going to do what now? You're going to relaunch the brand. And so it was like, oh, whoa. But what do? Do you, just wait? Do you wait for the pandemic to be over? Do you wait for the next quarter to be over? And so I think that you can't be tone deaf to what's happening around you, but that doesn't freeze you in time. And so I think that was the other lesson for me personally in terms of how to lead when you're in a very challenging, as you say, human environment where the tragedy is immense, but you still have to stay optimistic and you still have a business to support. And how do you keep going on that? So I think some of the tenets haven't changed. I think the angle may be a little different and how you did it. By the way, we did that campaign in 6 weeks. Now, and I have thought
that's fantastic. That's unheard of, actually. That's really, being a branding strategist, that is incredibly fast.
I think it would have taken us longer had we been in person. And so I think there's some learnings there in terms of just how I think you can.
I've heard that from a lot of my clients, that there were things that they know had they not taken them on during the pandemic would have taken 2 or 3 times longer. And just the nature of everything, things happened faster. And I think without having a pandemic, I think we can still extract learnof from that as leaders that we can use with our teams.
I complete that. That was one example of our brand campaign. The other thing that we did there, which again was a bit of a risk, is that one of our founders, Robert Noyce, has this great expression, and it's everywhere. It's on the walls at Intel, which is, don't be encumbered by the past. Now go off and do something wonderful. And again, in the middle of a pandemic. So I was worried about go off. I can't go anywhere. I'm in a pandemic, but wonderful. Talking about something wonderful really gave, I think, our employees, my team, our customers and partners a reason to believe and to have hope and to look at kind of what is possible and what is wonderful. So again, a little bit of a risk. I think we had to have our tone and, as you say, be extremely respectful. But also, be optimistic about what's ahead of us. And I am.
There's a great book called Man in His Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And he was a psychiatrist or a psychiatrist who had been in a concentration camp. And one of the things he talks about in this book is, even in that most dire of circumstance, there were people who managed to bring this sense of hope and, optimism and meaning to their lives. And it wasn't in any way, of course, he was in the camp diminishing that experience or the suffering. He just was saying that as humans, we always can bring meaning to things. And that's really the bottom line of what I hear you saying, is that it's our job as leaders to bring meaning to things, regardless of the circumstances, because the circumstances are rarely perfect. And certainly in the last year and a half, the circumstances have been incredibly difficult for many, many, many people. But it's that ability to bring meaning as a leader that is truly what defines leadership. Well, Karen, I wish we had another hour and a half. It went so fast, this little fireside chat. I really want to thank you and for everything you shared. It was really, I think, very useful and beautiful. For the people listening, Karen Walker is the Senior Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer at Intel. I'm Karen Tiber Leland. I'm the founder of Sterling Marketing Group and the author of the brand mapping strategy, Build, Design, and Accelerate Your Brand. Thank you all so much for joining us today.